EdTech is to India what e-commerce is to China. This is what Bloom Ventures said in its report in 2020. And it wasn't just Bloom. Most investors of all kinds and sizes thought of Indian EdTech as once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The idea was simple. India has close to 300 million students. These students would spend billions of dollars on education and upskilling in the next few decades. And because of cheap data prices in India, thanks to Jio, it is very easy for a company to reach to these students. This dream was further exaggerated by Indian VCs and founders to their investors, which brought unprecedented amount of funding in Indian EdTech startups. In just 8 years since 2014, more than $10 billion were invested. 8 billion out of which was invested just in a span of 3 years. Fast forward to now, there's a sense of uncertainty looming on this sector. The biggest player in this space is on the verge of bankruptcy. Tens of thousands of EdTech employees have been laid off, and investors don't want to invest any new money. So let's understand how all of this happened. How did a promising sector go from boom to bust in just a span of couple years? India's EdTech story as we know today began in 2015-16. Before that, education and tech were largely two different domains. And even though few players tried to marry the two, they did not succeed very much. And the main reason for this was low internet adoption in India, which up until now was less than 20%. Companies like Unacademy and PhysicsWallah were just a YouTube channel at this point. BYJU'S too was in its early days and was just starting with video-based learning through its website, and had not launched its mobile app. During this time, EdTech as a business model did not exist. And no one could predict that in just a few years, hundreds of millions of Indian students will come online and a multi-billion-dollar market would take shape. This eventually did happen mainly thanks to Reliance Jio, whose cheap high-speed internet meant that suddenly everyone was getting online. And businesses including EdTech suddenly had an access to millions of new students. This was the time when EdTech companies started thinking big. Their TAM, which is total addressable market, had suddenly inflated. Take a look at this report from University of Pennsylvania. It had put India's EdTech market size at close to 300 million students, which included both school and higher education. And these kind of reports attracted the attention of foreign investors, who then started looking at opportunities in India to invest in. And one of the most benefited companies at this time was BYJU'S. They had an early mover advantage in K-12 segment and had blended the use of technology very well. In 2016 alone, BYJU'S raised $150 million, which was almost half of the entire EdTech funding in India in that year. EdTech at this time was like a gold rush. New companies were forming and investors poured money like there is no tomorrow. Take a look at these funding numbers. In just 6 years, funding in India's EdTech sector grew 20 times. This madness in the Indian EdTech sector was further fueled by the pandemic. These 300 million Indian students that we talked about earlier suddenly found themselves stuck at home. And this was the perfect opportunity for the EdTech startups to expand into every possible segment that they could. Unacademy, for example, which was a platform for JEE and NEET preparation, saw the K-12 as a big opportunity and acquired 2 brands to get into this segment. BYJU'S, which was already serving the K-12 segment, acquired as many as 7 companies to further consolidate their position. And these are just the big companies I've mentioned here. There were a dozen more funded startups which were open during the pandemic to fulfill the sudden demand of school students. And this madness was made possible by investors. You see, during the pandemic, central banks across the world had kept interest rates low. And this resulted in excess liquidity in the market. According to an EdTech executive quoted by the Morning Context, investors like SoftBank, Tiger and Sequoia were sitting on too much money from their limited partners. And there was no sector as lucrative as EdTech in India. And so the funding in Indian EdTech startups, which was $419 million in 2019, went up to $2.2 billion in 2020 and $4.7 billion in 2021. So now startups were funded well. And what do you do as a young startup if you have too much money? You spend on marketing. And since everyone had money, it created a lot of temporary competition in the market. And do you know what happens when there is too much competition? The customer acquisition cost or the CAC goes up. So for a sector like EdTech, where CAC before the pandemic was 20 to 25% of the total revenue, it increased to almost 70 to 80%. This, however, did not stop these companies from pouring more and more money into the marketing and hence expanding their user base as much as possible. This resulted in their revenue in the short term go up. Look at these numbers. These were the revenue figures of some of the leading EdTech companies in FY20, and these were their numbers in FY21. Look at that last column of growth. And as I said, this revenue growth was just in the short term. Because of the rising CAC that I mentioned earlier, the unit economics wasn't making sense for these companies anymore. Let me explain why. There is something called LTV to CAC ratio, which founders and investors use to make sense for the unit economics of a company. And the general rule of thumb is that this ratio should be 3:1 for an EdTech company, which means that you should not be spending more than 30% of the money to acquire a customer than the total revenue you will make from that customer in the lifetime. And as we discussed, this ratio was reaching almost 80% for the EdTech companies. And so for a company like BYJU'S, whose lifetime value of a customer was around 20,000 rupees, it was spending 15,000 rupees just to acquire that customer. This wasn't hurting the startups as long as they were raising new funding. But as 2021 turned to 2022, financial markets turned bad.
This recession wave is picking its targets. Today, two countries slipped into a recession, Japan and the United Kingdom. Both are major economies and both are shrinking.
Russia's economy, it shrank for its second quarter. Experts say
it's been a fierce race against time for European nations looking to fill up their gas storage ahead of winter.
This was combined with the schools reopening in India after the lockdown, which resulted in the demand for online education suddenly plummet. And so on one hand, VCs were finding hard to put more money, the existing users of these startups were leaving them. This was a time for a hard realization. Billions of dollars had been spent by these companies to acquire users, but they did not find a way to monetize them. And now that the students are gone, they will never be able to do so. The valuation of these EdTech companies, which had grown astronomically, especially in the last 2 years, did not make sense. The EdTech bubble was bursting. To understand what was happening during this time, we can divide EdTech startups into two buckets. One where the companies were heavily funded and still had money in the bank to sustain, and the other bucket of smaller companies who did not have long enough runway. And for these smaller players, there was no way out. Most of them had to shut down their business and let go of their employees. In 2022 alone, at least 25 funded EdTech startups had to shut down, and the ones which were lucky got acquired by a bigger company. The most famous case we know about is Doubtnut, the company that had more than 50 million users and had once received an acquisition offer of $150 million by BYJU'S. They rejected this offer and continued to burn money to acquire more users. But once the funding winter hit, they had no other choice but to force sell themselves at just $10 million. Then there were bigger companies like BYJU'S, Unacademy and Upgrad. They still had enough money in the bank to experiment and find ways to overcome this crisis. BYJU'S, for example, focused its resources on expanding overseas. In 2021 alone, the company spent $2.4 billion to acquire companies like Epic and Great Learning. It further signed Lionel Messi as their global brand ambassador for a campaign. Unacademy, on the other hand, started acquiring companies in adjacent categories. For example, they acquired TapChief, which was a networking and recruitment platform. Another company they acquired was Handa Ka Funda, which was a CAT and MBA prep platform. And with these acquisitions, Unacademy was trying to disrupt the whole education space in India. Now, although these seemed like great strategies at the time, it did not pan out the way these companies expected. You see, because of this sudden expansion, these companies had spread themselves too thin. They had hired thousands of new people to run these businesses. And so on one hand, their focus from their core business had moved away, their expenses ballooned up. For example, BYJU'S losses increased from 305 crore rupees in FY20 to 4,500 crore rupees in FY21. And because of funding winter, this wasn't sustainable and hence started layoffs.
Layoffs in India's online education space continue.
And Indian Edtech giant BYJU'S has laid off nearly 1,000 employees across all departments.
Tracking all these EdTech giants, their rise and their fall and their layoffs.
And there is no end to the number of layoffs.
To To tell you how bad the things got, Unacademy announced there won't be free meals at the company anymore. And while most of the edtech companies were struggling at this time, there was one company which was quietly redefining the edtech in India. Alak Pandey had started PhysicsWallah as a YouTube channel in 2016. And for the first 6 years, he bootstrapped the company, acquiring students organically. In the midst of market turmoil in 2022, when the other companies were struggling to raise money, PhysicsWallah raised their first ever funding round of $100 million at a $1 billion valuation. And while the other companies were posting massive losses, PhysicsWallah was making handsome profits. Alak Pandey had presented a new model for the Indian Edtech, something that the incumbents had failed to do till now. So finally, what does the future look like for this space? Is the edtech dead in India, or is there a sustainable model here? See, the biggest learning from the last few years has been that there was a lack of trust in online-only model. Education in India has historically been an offline model, where students pay for a brand, which either could be a coaching institution or a teacher, also known today as star teachers. Coaching institutions like Akash and Bansal classes have built a brand over many decades, and that's why parents spend lakhs of rupees on these classes without much thought. On the other hand, edtech companies had to work very hard to sell a 5,000 rupees course. Same with the teachers. Alak Pandey built a brand by teaching for more than 10 years. And that's why he has been able to build a $1 billion company just because of this brand. Now, all of this does not mean that the future of edtech is only offline. Technology will definitely play a vital role in scaling this business, and hence it will bring the cost down for the students. And that is why companies are now focusing on a hybrid model, where they are opening offline centers in order to build trust and then use online mode to scale and offer more facilities like doubt solving tools and 24/7 recorded classes. PhysicsWallah understood this early on. They launched their first offline center, PW Vidyapeeth, in 2022. And today they have 67 centers across the country. Other companies are now doing the same. BYJU'S, for example, acquired Akash, a strong offline brand for higher exam preparations. Same with Unacademy and Upgrad, who have big plans of expanding offline in the future. These offline centers will work as acquisition channels for these companies, and once they have acquired a user, they will use technology and AI to keep them and give better experience over time. In the end, I want to hear from you. What do you think is the future of edtech? And which company, according to you, will be the leader in the next 5 to 10 years? Share your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.